Okay. I think we have a sufficient number of folks here right now who have wandered in from a gorgeous day. So we can start talking in just a couple minutes. For those of you who haven't been to the lunch programs that I run, my name's Dick Pullman. I teach here at the Writers Program, and maybe this is somewhat relevant today. I also write a political column at dickpullman.net. That's that's my product placement for the morning. Thank you for the Writers House again for continuing to host these events. There's two more coming up, which I will just briefly mention before we get to today's program. On March 16th, Monday, March 16th, week from Monday, I'm hosting a Philadelphia Inquirer writer, a feature writer, I guess you can call him, named Jason Nark, N-A-R-K. And like many reporters who do fabulous work, people don't know bylines. But Jason's really worth coming and listening to. His beat is he roams the state of Pennsylvania, gets outside Philadelphia in the suburbs here, roams the state through the T and through the rural areas, and finds quirky, unusual people to write about and make them compelling. And so he's very good on the whole issue of how do you approach strangers, how do you write about them. He also just got back very recently from a trip. The Inquirer sent him out to Europe, to Auschwitz, which just had a big anniversary event. It's their 75th, I think, and so the Inquirer sent him out there, and I plan to ask him about what that was like. On April 15th, which is a Wednesday, I'm hosting a political columnist who has been a veteran political columnist named Walter Shapiro, who's been in the business for, at least 35, 40 years perhaps. He teaches up at Yale, but he's going to come down and talk about his political commentary and about the presidential race. And who knows where the presidential race is going to be on April 15th. I didn't know where it was going to be 4 days ago, so we can only imagine. He's coming down actually because the Pennsylvania primary is at the end of April, and it may have something to say this year, which is somewhat rare. Anyway, so for today's program, typically speaking, over the years, 95% of the people I've invited in have been writers and reporters primarily. And today we have what I would consider to be one of the most prominent editors based on the 5 years, her 5-year stint as the op-ed editor of the New York Times, which is, deciding what kind of guest columns to run. And Trish did that for 5 years. You ran 6 feature sections at the New York Times over the course of 20 years or so?
I was there about 25. Is this working?
Yes.
I was there about 25 years. I'd actually started as a food writer, and I did a lot of different things and ended up in op-ed, right?
So,
ran feature sections.
And a lot of 6 feature sections. Previous to that, you worked at the Wall Street Journal.
He's not starting with the most important thing, which is that the lessons that really stick with you and the memories often happen in your 20s. And I was the editor of the New Haven Advocate, which you probably remember when they were called alternative papers, which came right after underground papers. And Dick was the editor of the Hartford Advocate. And we had the same owners, and we had to cooperate a lot on stories. But we were also somewhat competitive.
You know what? I forgot about that part, actually. We're talking, I guess I didn't want to bring it up because if we're talking about our 20s, we're talking about the Jimmy Carter administration. So
okay.
Be that as it may. So we had a history. And then it was the Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press, and then at the Times. And the book, Writing to Persuade, which is new and is out for sale out there, which is what we'll be talking a lot about, the art of editing opinion. So please welcome Trish Hall. Trish, why don't you just fill us in on what you've been doing the last few years and why you thought it was important to write this book and what the book is basically trying to communicate to us all as readers, if nothing else. And then we'll talk for a bit,
okay.
And then we'll open it up.
I was just sort of, I guess, like a journalism nerd in the sense that I believed in sort of the truth and facts and reporting. I was a reporter before I was an editor. I would switch back and forth a lot because I really liked both. And And then when I became the op-ed editor, which was a fairly big switch from what I'd been doing, but not as bizarre as it sounds, I went from the feature sections to op-ed partly because at the time, the Times understood, this was in 11, the Times understood that opinion everywhere was getting more and more important to people and more popular. And so they wanted to take the section that had been called Sunday, the Week in Review, which was sort of oriented, it had its passionate readers, but it was oriented toward looking back. And of course, as everything got more digital, you had to be more oriented toward the future. And I always liked putting together like sections, putting together different points of view, surprising things, as long as, trying to figure out what would really capture readers within that sort of ecosystem of a section. So op-ed was an incredible privilege, which surprised me because that period was not at all what it is now for the Times. We were firing people in the previous 10 years. I was in management, so I was involved. It was a terrible time. We sold the building. We had no money. The digital companies were really booming, and the old print companies were dying. But it was clear the Times had to get more digital. And it was really remarkable to me how many people wanted to be an op-ed, because part of me thought, oh, the Times is just this poor old dinosaur. But it had a power for people. And just the fact that so many people wanted to write op-eds and they wanted to write letters. I mean, I didn't edit the letters and I didn't write the editorials. Op-ed was strictly concerned with opinion from the outside. And maybe it goes with this person liking facts, but I'm not as opinionated as one might think, given that I was an opinion editor. Or I'm really just, my husband thinks I'm a terrible contrarian. Maybe that's better. Whatever anybody else is doing, I actually want to do the opposite. So I loved opinion because the idea of op-ed was to present opinions that were different from the editorial page. And the Times editorial page is this sort of classically centrist liberal thing. So I liked getting right wing and left wing and just shaking it up was the goal of op-ed. What was interesting to me, a lot of it's like any other kind of journalism. It's like being a news editor in the newsroom. I think a lot about, I don't know why, health and disease I've always been really interested in, and epidemiology. And, right now I'm a consultant and I edit articles for people and I also ghostwrite them. And some of them are faculty, some of them are in corporations. And people send me things like how important it is for people to wash their hands. And I'm like, that was 2 weeks ago. You have to be thinking ahead. I think watching people's behavior in this sort of maybe epidemic, you think, how is it going to change social life? Are people going to be with their families more? Are they going to get divorced more? Are they going to, are they going to not get other illnesses because they're so crazily washing their hands? That's what op-ed was like. I had about 12 editors and some news assistants working for me, and I tried to make it as non-hierarchical as possible because I was much older than a lot of people there. And so the goal of any good ed operation is to get as many ideas as you can get, different ideas. So we would have morning meetings and just talk about what was in the news and think about who we might want to call to write something. And then we also received about 1,000 unsolicited articles a week. And we had a couple of news assistants who, they burned out pretty quickly. As you can imagine, they didn't necessarily read the entire thing, but they'd read the first couple of graphs. So what I've always tried to tell to people who want to write is there is nothing more important than your first few paragraphs. Because if you don't have people there, they have too much to do. It's just over. So one reason I wanted to write the book, after op-ed, I had a newsroom job where, in a sort of effort to stay alive, the Times was really trying to think of new projects that could get advertising sponsorships, that could make a lot of money. I used to be one of the business editors. I'm really interested in business, so it was a natural thing for me to do. But I don't know how many of you have worked in corporations, but when you're in sort of that part of it, you spend a lot of time in meetings, and I didn't really like meetings. So I decided to write this book, and partly because one thing I could see in op-ed was that you could take the same set of facts and make very different arguments. And when I started to research the book, thinking about the proposal, probably the most shocking thing for me as a person, given how I looked at the world, was that people aren't really all that influenced by facts. They are occasionally, but it's not the most powerful thing in persuasion. And I felt like I'd been sort of stupid not to know that. It's like, So when I started working on the book, there were a lot of surprises like that. The book is sort of a combination of my history and journalism. It's kind of like the elements of style. There's a lot of basic writing information, but there's also a lot on the psychology of persuasion. And that's what I found most fascinating. One reason I'm looking forward to your questions is you might not be interested in that at all. Everybody's interested in different things. And one thing I always try to tell writers, and I also learned from writers who wrote for me, was that you have to know your audience. You have to know where they are and what might move them. Because if you just start off, there are a lot of principles of persuasion. And I know Trump seems like a strong argument against this, but people are complicated. Basically, they don't want to be yelled at. They are mostly persuaded by their peers, by their friends, by people who agree with them. You're much more likely to change someone's mind if they're in your circle than if they're not, and if you can establish some common ground. So that part of it I found amazing, sort of researching how they get suspected terrorists to talk. What makes people want to talk? How do you bring them over to your side? And I've been talking on and off about the book quite a bit because it came out in hardcover last June, and it always ends up with, my cousin voted for Trump. How do I get her to stop? How do I change her mind? And unfortunately, the biggest, truest lesson is that the first step is to listen to that person and find out why they think the way they think and how they feel and understand them. And that's not something most people really want to do, and it's not something they're very good at. So persuasion takes a long time. But as an editor, I think what I found most attractive, and I think most editors do, if any of you are writers and you're trying to get published, you want something new. You want something you haven't heard before. That sounds so basic as to be ridiculous, but most of the pieces that we got when I was an op-ed didn't tell me anything I didn't know. And that's one of, I mean, you know this, that's one of the problems of being a journalist. It's your job to read. So you may not, you're not smarter than other people, but you may sort of know more, at least on a surface level. So that was one of the harder things. Like, we'd have these meetings and be like, everyone knows that, everyone knows that. Well, maybe they don't. Maybe we just know that because we're not typical and we spend all our time reading. So a lot of what we would try to do would find new ways, even by using history into kind of old stories, because people are they're interested in a lot of the same things sort of permanently, you know, and whether you're in a feature section in the Times, there's always going to be a group of people who want to know how to raise their kids, because there's always people who are just having children. So that's why it's so important to have a variety of like ages and points of view and perspectives. It was really the intensity of those and the effect of your generation was really interesting in op-ed, because we had a lot of young editors and news assistants, and we had a lot of arguments about, I did a lot of things they didn't like publish Woody Allen. They thought that, you know, in response to his daughter saying that he had sexually abused her, publishing some pieces that questioned aspects of the transgender rights movement. I mean, I thought it was my job to be provocative within a certain sort of Timesian structure. But people in their 20s just thought I was just some weird old Berkeley 60s person, which I am. So it's interesting. It's interesting to have a lot of different ages discussing things. I mean, I find it fascinating that young people like Bernie, because I can't imagine being young and even looking at someone that old. They don't exist. So the fact that he is, I find it really interesting. I've probably gone on too long.
Well,
now it's your turn to ask questions.
Let me pick up on a couple things you said. Tell the story in terms of pieces that let me clarify one thing about Woody Allen's, and then I want to get to the question. And you mentioned this in the book, that your thoughts about publishing the piece by Woody Allen was basically that he had a side of the story to tell because it was in the news.
And she wrote a long piece that we ran as part of Nick Kristoff's blog. So my argument was it's just a sort of principle of justice to give him, and also if he had been convicted, I wouldn't have felt that way. If he had even been charged, I don't know if I would have felt that way, but he wasn't. So it seemed like a matter of justice.
Yeah. You notice that
they didn't agree.
They didn't agree. So did you see what the statement Ronan Farrow put out?
Yes, it was fascinating. Yeah, he's broken with his publisher because the publisher is publishing Woody Allen. It's very interesting. I mean, it's just.
Did you regret? Did you regret writing? You have to tell everybody the Vladimir Putin story. All right. Did you? Because here's someone who lost sleep, according to the book, because she was going to be publishing a piece of byline by Vladimir Putin, and she lost some sleep. Like, is it real? Is it not real? Tell people the story and what the issues came up about that.
Well, if you work at the Times, like over the years, people have always criticized Times reporters for being too cautious. Right now, the structure of that argument is that there's both sidism. There's a lot of conflicts within journalism about the best way to do it. And the Times reporters and editors probably are more cautious than a lot of other institutions because you just get slammed. Everything you do gets looked at. I actually didn't tweet when I was at the Times. I didn't post on Facebook because it's like, what is to be gained? I mean, if you're a reporter, you kind of have to. But you're just criticized constantly. And so you try to be careful. I mean, you try to be careful anyway, but you try to be more careful. So, we had things come in unsolicited. We had things from PR people. We had things from academics that we knew. The range was huge. So a PR person I didn't know emailed me one day and said that he had a piece from Putin. And, it sort of looked like a legit email. And so then I told my boss about it. He had Andy Rosenthal. He was a great editor. He'd been Washington bureau chief. He was the opinion deputy and then the editor. But at one point, he'd been a correspondent in Moscow, and and we're both really interested in Russia and Putin, and partly for the sort of, this was before Trump, so everyone's more interested now. It has a different cast to it, but so we decided to do it, and he had to ask the publisher to move an ad that was on the page. That was when we still got print ads on the page. That's not really happening anymore. And we wanted to give it extra space. And then, it was I got caught up in the editing of it. It was very hard to edit because every word I wanted to change, they said no. Working with the fact checker, I know that we'll get really criticized if anything's wrong. Things can be open to interpretation, but they can't be wrong. So it went back and forth and back and forth. At one point, Andy said, oh yeah, I talked to the Moscow bureau and they said Putin was going to submit something. And then I was just very caught up in it. I was sort of always really interested in Russian history. And then I got home and I see my husband, watch TV, have dinner. And then I'm like, I should have checked more. This could be a total scam. It is so satisfying for people to scam places like the Times. What is wrong with me? So yes, I tortured myself all night long. It was not a scam. There were also a lot of people who thought it was ridiculous to run Putin for the same reason. I'm still friends with people there. My successor is this great guy named Jim Dow, and that he had to deal with the whole, should he run anonymous? And we've talked a lot about things like that. And people always ask me, would you have done that? I don't know. You kind of have to be sitting there, and it's is it worth the world knowing what Putin thinks? Maybe, maybe not. Anonymous was probably more worthwhile, but it was totally against Times rules. We never ran anything anonymous in op-ed unless the person was in clear danger of being killed and could sort of prove it. So that was a big departure, and it took a lot of thinking on their part. But we can all be scammed so easily now. I mean, we all know that. The phone calls from the IRS and the texts that pop up on your phone. I mean, it's just the number of scams. So that is one of the scarier parts of opinion journalism now when you're dealing with outsiders, because obviously when you're dealing with your own staff or even your regular freelancers, you can make mistakes, and there can be big scams. There have obviously been in journalism, but they're rare, and mostly you can trust the people you're working with. So that was one of the, I mean, that was an extreme example, but that was one of the more frightening parts of op-ed. We had several fact checkers, and we checked facts really, really carefully. But we would ask people if they had conflicts of interest, and they would say no. And I didn't have that happen, but it happened to me once. I think it's happened to Jim. And then later you find out they lied. They did have conflicts of interest. And then you have to run a editor's note saying, sorry, they did.
One last thing on Putin, then we'll let that one go. So how long did the editing, if they were resisting like every word and every edit had to go through the PR agency and then back to Moscow on Moscow time, how many days did the editing take?
I think we just did it in one day, maybe 2 at the most. I like really clean, simple writing, so I kept trying to tighten things up. That was what they resisted. I mean, there weren't a ton of facts. The fact checking, the fact checker was really excellent, and he had a few things, and they agreed to that. But all of my efforts to make it smoother and make it meet what I thought of as sort of my standards for clarity failed. So then that's the other interesting thing about op-ed. When you're an editor and a reporter's working for you, you're their boss. Like, you have to get along with them, but you pretty much decide. They don't really have that much leverage. But all of the op-ed writers do. Once you accept their piece, they have a lot of leverage, and they see the final product, and they can say no. I mean, we certainly had people, we edited people, and then if they didn't like their edits, they just withdrew the piece. I mean, that happened especially with famous writers.
I wonder why. So looking back, was there ever a piece that you rejected that in retrospect you thought would have been worthwhile to run?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, we might have accidentally rejected things, because there would be occasions, I can't remember a piece in particular, but I'd see something in the Washington Post and I'd think, oh, why didn't they send it to us? And then I'd think, maybe they did. Maybe it was in our, in that big clump, and the news assistant was on the phone with his mother or something. I mean, I don't know, because I did have a case where we had a story. This guy was announcing his leaving Goldman Sachs because he thought it was a disgusting corporation. He could no longer work there. He didn't tell them, he told us. And it turned out that he was just about to take it somewhere else, but he didn't, because he knew someone in the newsroom who told me about it, that had come in, and one of our 22-year-old news assistants didn't think it was interesting, which surprised me, because I assume they always wish they could quit their jobs in the New York Times. But yeah, it's a matter of taste what's interesting, and I think that was probably interesting to me because I was a business reporter. Wasn't interesting to everyone.
So yeah, you mentioned so the clump. If you're getting, what was the figure you used? 1,000?
It'd be between like 700 and 1,000, I think.
Okay, 700,000 every
week.
Every week. So not all those pieces can possibly be read, no matter how many assistants you had, right?
Well, I mean, that sort of includes what would go to all the editors. We all got a lot individually, because you want to be accessible to the public. A lot of people I know put their emails out there very happily because you want people to reach you. So a lot just came directly to us individually. They weren't all read totally. I think the first and second drafts were all read.
And you could tell, right? If they.
I don't think you can tell. I mean, in the beginning, I would everything that came to me directly, I would try to read the whole thing, because I would think there might be something really interesting here. And then you just can't. You can't have a life and do that. So
all right, so
that's why I'm so big on the first paragraph.
Right, exactly. So what percentage of pieces over those 1,000 pieces a week? So what percentage of the pieces that the Times generally gets is it able to run, actually make it through and go public? 2%? 1? I don't even know.
I mean, we ran fewer then. We probably ran 2 in print each day and a few digitally. Maybe we ran 5. 6. It was more each year. Now they sometimes run as many as 14, 15, 16 a day.
Because of the online.
Because of
is so
digital,
robust.
and they've also increased the size of the staff. I mean, Trump has been a really wonderful thing for the New York Times. Stock has never been better, sales have never been better, and the passion for political discourse has never been stronger. So they have put a lot of money into opinion and hired more editors, more diverse editors, geographically, racially, gender. So there are more international editors. So that's made a big difference. And so in theory, of course, your space digitally is unlimited, but it's really limited by the ability to edit and fact check it. And the fact checking is more important than the editing, really, because we don't know these people often. So I don't know what the percentage odds are, because I don't know how many they get now. They might get more.
They might get more. So, okay, that's funny. What you said is because Trump's been good for the Times. He says it's the failing New York Times.
I know.
So, is he wrong?
Well,
that
now
was a joke. But
the Times just hired a new media columnist, and his first column was about how the success of the Times is bad for everything else, which I think he's a wonderful writer. I actually didn't follow. His logic on that did not convince me. But if you have the resources to be a publication in this environment, there's certainly the appetite for it. I mean, I think that is one of the great things that's going on right now, is that people who are never interested in politics are. Like everyone I know who's not a journalist, because journalists are not allowed to do this, is like canvassing and making phone calls and going door to door. And it's like, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Most people stopped caring about politics at the point where they had kids, and it's like now everyone's like alive again. It's nice.
Well, all right, and so that's that brings up an interesting question, which we just talked about actually before we sat down a little bit. So you were op-ed editor between 2011 and 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 2015 was the year Trump came down the escalator. That was your last year. Would you, given everything that you just said, wouldn't this be like a fabulous time to be the op-ed editor? Do you wish you were, for the reasons we're talking about?
I don't. I mean
people say. My wife says all the time, "What if he's the greatest journalism story ever?" So as a journalist, one should be like totally stoked about it.
I guess I might want to be a reporter, because I think the number of stories related to him, or that his election has sort of inspired or made people. I grew up in a really small, poor town in Pennsylvania, so it's been very interesting to watch the public discover these states, and I think he forced people to see that there was a lot that they didn't know, just like every movement does. I mean, that may have been a movement by the right wing, but there's also, Black Lives Matter and Me Too. Like, a lot's happened, and that forced people to sort of see more. So I think it's a really interesting time to be a reporter. If I were the op-ed editor, I think I would find it very challenging, because it's hard. Even though they have this much bigger, more diverse staff right now, I do find that most of it still seems to be about politics. And I think I was more free to run a lot of more sort of sociological stories. Like one of the most popular Sunday covers when I was there was called The Busy Trap, and it was about how everybody says they're busy and they're busy and they're busy, and that's really just like because they're afraid of dying, and like how we all deal with time and space and busyness and all the structures we create. I ran a lot of sort of philosophical, sociological, psychological stories about health. I'm, ADD. Just, there was a big range, and I feel like I had the freedom to run a big range because there wasn't a situation like Trump. It was just it was just a very different time. So I ran a big range. I think now it's got to be difficult, because how do you find some new opinion? You might find new news, but how do you find a new opinion piece? I think about this a lot. I read, The Guardian and the Washington Post and Dick's column. I read all the opinion I can find, because I have clients and I need to help them understand what's new and what people have already written about. And I just think it's overwhelmingly about politics now. So if you want to write something that's not, I mean, I am really interested in business, and I work with a bunch of business professors, and they have a lot of interesting research. I think it's harder to get those things published now than it used to be, because people are both sick of reading about politics and that's all they want to read.
That's okay. That's a weird combo, but it's true.
I mean, I don't know if that's true, but I see my own behavior. I'm like, okay, I'm only going to read this stuff for 2 hours today, and then I'm still there looking at my phone.
So I would imagine also then that for, I don't know, what your successor tells you or not, but that the persuasion, the ability to persuade, people, at least my impression is that people are much more now in their partisan silos than ever before, certainly in the last few years, to the point where they can't even talk across, the aisle, as it were. And so that seems to be even a bigger challenge when you are, editing or trying to write something about Trump that's attempting to persuade somebody of something who might ostensibly be on the fence.
I mean, I think it's very natural to people to sort of stick with their tribe or whatever, and there are people who try to break that. I have this friend I became friends with because I went to speak at his organization at Yale, and he's a rabbi, he's conservative, he voted for Trump, and he has events at Yale. He also has events in New York where he just tries to bring people together with different points of view, and I really like him, and I think what he's doing is important, and he listens to different points of view. He brings in all kinds of speakers. But one of the ones I went to recently, it's like everybody was just screaming at each other. It's really hard to listen. It's really hard for people to listen to different points of view now. I mean, it just is. I mean, when a couple of people in that audience, and this is in Brooklyn, said that they had voted for Trump, I thought my husband was going to strangle them. I think that's I think because journalists are really forced to not be like that. So you're sort of trained to not do that. But I don't think that's natural, actually. I don't think it's surprising that people are like this. And all of our media amplifies it, and the way you can choose your own media. Like, I don't watch MSNBC and I don't watch Fox because I just don't like I don't like all the hysteria, but I see lots of people love the hysteria. I mean, they wouldn't call it hysteria. They think of it as passion. So it really just depends on how you look at it. It's really hard to really understand how someone else looks at something.
Yeah. So I think it's frustrating. There were two lines in your book, many pages apart. So where you said, I have them here. One of them is, "We believe what we believe," which is kind of what you were just saying. But right near the end at the end, you said, "I have faith in the power of persuasion." So well,
I had to end the book somehow.
You have to end on an upbeat note.
I mean, because
right?
things change. I mean, that's the thing. Like, it's really hard, and yet you look at another person that we worked with when we were in Connecticut was Gail Collins, who is a columnist at the Times and has a new book out on the history of the history of older women in America. But before that, she's written other books on women's history. And I always find, she's been a friend of mine for a long time, and she's a really good influence because I can get like, and she's like, you've got to look at how much things have changed. Like, when I left college in 1972, the Help Wanted ads were still male, female. I mean, that may seem like a really minor thing, but it's not. It never feels like there's been enough change, and it never feels like it's been fast enough. But there has been change. I mean, look at people. Nobody in this room is smoking. You're not allowed to smoke in this room. The way people live, the way they exercise, the way they don't smoke as much. I mean, there's much change that happens, and it happens through social change. What's interesting to me about social change, I just sort of couldn't believe the Me Too movement. It's like, women have been complaining about men forever. So how did this suddenly, instantly seem to happen? So it's sometimes things take forever, and then sometimes they just explode. And so it's hard to make generalizations about persuasion because I feel like sometimes it really takes decades to make these changes. and other times it's really fast.
Yeah. Pete Buttigieg is a perfect
I know.
Look at that.
Holding
Taken seriously.
having his arm around his husband.
On
This is the
stage.
most wonderful thing and,
Yeah.
and shocking.
Yeah. We've been covering a lot of ground here. Any questions? We're going to open it up to questions for a while. Yeah. Oh, you do? I'm sorry. I meant to point that out.
I was interested because I'm a big reader of op-eds, and it seems like more and more it's top experts in the field, and that seems like a change from a while ago. So I was wondering to what extent, in other words, other people could put their opinions in. They didn't have to be the number one researcher in something. To what extent are any of the op-eds that come in solicited?
You know, a lot of them were solicited. And I think I totally agree with you. And I think one thing that's happened is that the Times, when I was there, the Times was criticized rightly for having this lineup of mostly white male columnists. So we tried to diversify it by having contributing writers from different parts of the U.S., different parts of the world. Then those contributing columnists were all writing a column a month. Then they got more columnists, and then they got more regulars. So I think, I don't know if this is true of every publication, but certainly true of the Times now. They have so many regular people, regular writers. They may only be writing once a month, but it kind of adds up, that I feel like I see way fewer of the just random regular person, which I think is a big loss. I mean, I understand what motivated them to do it, to have more different kinds of voices, but once you have a big variety of regular voices, then it's just the person who just randomly sends in something, the odds are lower. There's less bandwidth for that.
Has the Times considered doing a larger, another section which is more of other people writing? It seems to me.
Well, that's kind of what the letters to the editor are, but they're shorter. Yeah,
And
but
there's
they're
not
very
that many of
short.
them either.
Right. I mean, everything is a matter of staff constraints and also your sense of what's a good product and how much can people read. I know a lot of people now, both who work in op-ed and people who read op-ed, who think there's too much. Like there was a desire to have as much digital presence as possible, but then it's like, what's too much? Nobody really knows. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't know what the solution is.
Yes, we have questions from that row. A couple.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm a grad student from Dallas, and I've followed the Texas Tribune for a number of years, and I'm really excited to see the 19th coming out of Texas. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on this kind of new trend of nonprofit newsrooms and what impact that might have on op-eds.
Oh, its impact on op-eds. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that. I mean, I follow a lot of the nonprofit newsroom stuff, and it's interesting now there's that's definitely getting somewhere, but there's some people who think it's never going to be enough and you really need government funding of journalism. Hard to say. But I think of most of them when I think of Politico and the Marshall Report and all these things as being focused on news and investigation. Does the Texas Tribune have op-eds?
I'm actually not sure.
I'm not sure. I don't know if any of them.
The 19th hasn't fully launched, so I'm kind of waiting to see what they'll be doing.
I don't know if they. I mean, the Atlantic has some op-eds. BuzzFeed recently started op-eds. The whole sort of op-eds in the digital world have not. There's some, but I don't know. I mean, whatever gives people. What I like to tell clients or anybody who wants to write, because I edit Friends a lot, is there's usually some place to publish something. There's so many outlets. So somebody might want to be in the New York Times, but there's many other places. But the sort of digital culture, I don't think of as. Does Politico have op-eds? I don't think they do.
They did. They had a columnist, Roger Simon.
Oh, right.
Yeah, for a long time.
Huh.
And they have Rich Lowry from National Review.
Right.
Writes a conservative piece every once in a
Right.
while. Not
But yeah,
too
that's
many.
more like a columnist. Yeah. Do you have a sense of whether they all should have op-eds, or are they going in that direction?
I don't really know. I think it'll be interesting to see with the 19th, like has like a very like specific kind of reporting like mandate.
What's the mandate?
So their focus is like on women and gender and politics.
Oh, that's right. I
And
forgot it
so,
was called the
and they'll
19th.
launch this summer. Like they'll do their full launch. But I think like with the like fundraising element, it creates like a really like tricky like balance of like
Right.
ensuring like that your editorial process is like not influenced by that. And
Right.
so it's just something that I'm interested in.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, of course, why there's so much conversation about whether you could or would ever justify government funding. But, I mean, you may not ever need that in a place like Philadelphia or New York, but when you're talking about small towns, there's not going to be any it's going to be rough. Any other?
Yeah, right here. Zarn up, and then we'll come.
So I write for the college newspaper here under their opinion department. And
Great.
something that the opinion department, I guess, has been criticized for recently has been like this question of whether like it's justifiable to publish certain ideas, like if they're considered bad ideas, and give that idea a platform. And I think you referenced this a little bit about how when you were considering the Woody Allen post, like, am I bringing about justice by giving this alternative perspective?
Right.
So I guess like what goes into that consideration of what is like a justified balance of opinion, and is there such thing as giving a platform to bad ideas, and like what goes into that decision?
I mean, that's a really good question, and I think it's the kind of thing that people just have to argue at the moment. That's that case. This has been on my mind a lot recently because there's this somebody's writing a story for a magazine in California. When I was on the student newspaper at Berkeley, we wrote an editorial that started a riot, and we got kicked off campus, and we almost got indicted. Anyway, it was very... was that like a bad idea that we published? Was it just like, did we have no responsibility for what happened afterward?
What was the idea?
Take back the park, People's Park.
Oh, People's Park. That's famous.
So it's sort of like, that was, are you responsible for the consequences that ensue from what you put out there? Or is that the responsibility of the people who then take on that behavior? So it goes from like really literal things like that to more like just things that are... One thing I find really interesting is the whole who's allowed to tell what story, which also gets into op-eds. Can the woman who wrote the novel about... Yeah, I mean, it's like who can say what? I find it like troubling in almost every direction. Like I think that men should be able to write novels with female characters, and women should be able to write about men. I mean, it's like where do you draw those lines? How do you decide what I'd be very curious to know if there's a certain case you could tell us about, because it's only in the specifics that you can really, I think, sort of figure out what's the potential harm and what's the value. I think it always comes down to that, right? And I think when we did this editorial at Berkeley, we didn't think about any of that. I think people are probably more thoughtful now. I think people your age have more access to information. I don't know, people seem more sophisticated about information. I think we're just like, oh, let's take back the park. I don't think that's as common now. But I am curious whether there's a particular
Was there an episode?
argument. Was there an editorial?
Well, I guess like last semester there was an opinion column published about why legacy students like deserve to like be like why it's important that we have legacy students, and there was like
Why it's important that you have a what student?
legacy students,
Oh, legacy.
and
Oh, that's right. I remember that.
Oh, so somebody wrote a piece saying that legacy was reasonable to continue.
yeah, and so there was a huge like backlash after that. So I don't know, like it raises the question of like if there's like an opinion out there and there are students harmed by it, or like if the columnist is saying something that like feels like an attack at certain populations on this campus, like is it still a good thing to put out if it is an alternative view? And I guess that was just like a question.
Yeah, I mean, legacy is an interesting one because it's not inherent to some. I mean, if somebody were attacking women or black people or Hispanic people, there's something so that because that's just who gay people. That's who they are. There's something incredibly creepy about that. But if you're saying that legacy students shouldn't be on campus, you're not. It's sort of a different category of people, right? Like that seems more like a reasonable intellectual argument to have. Like it's good, or I mean, you could argue it's good, you could argue it's bad, you could argue it's both. But I mean, I do think the job of an opinion editor is to make people think. And, you know, one of the more controversial columnists at the Times is Bret Stephens, and his first column was on sort of questioning climate change.
Right.
I don't know why he started with that, but I think he's written some very interesting columns, and I think he does make people think. And you know, I might not agree with a lot of what he says, but I think that it really is your job as an opinion journalist to try to make people look at something they might not want to look at. So I think the whole question of legacy is fascinating. I would want to run every single viewpoint on that if I could, because it's so important on so many levels.
Yeah, don't you think you have to kind of, you can't self-censor. I mean, I come at personally from, maybe you agree, from a civil libertarian point of view that you have to have, you have to put as much stuff out into the marketplace of ideas as possible. But did you ever run into a situation, I'm sure you did, where you got feedback from the public in various forms where they said, I can't believe that you gave that the Times
all the time.
Gave a platform to X, Y, or Z.
Every day.
Every day, yeah.
No, I mean, Israel, I'd go to I think I mentioned this in the book, but I'd go to like my eye doctor. There are a lot of Jewish doctors in New York, and I would just be like, as soon as they asked me what I did, I would just be like killed. I was like, the Times is seen as anti-Israel, and it was just a constant thing. And I would always be having to do a list for the publisher showing there are 15 pro and 15 con in this time period. But, really good opinions shouldn't even be that easy to break down like that. It should be more subtle. It's not like... But yeah, people have very strong feelings about what you run, but that's partly why it's exciting to do it. You want to get people thinking about things. At least I did.
I think, we have over here, Deb, and then we'll come back to you.
Oh,
well, whatever.
just an
We'll
observation
get you next.
more than a question. It's a quick one. So I love Brooks and Shields, David Brooks and Mark Shields. And years ago, they used to be more point and counterpoint, and now they're point. And just an observation about, David Brooks, how much I really, really kind of like reading him now and see more of me with him because maybe it's the Trumpian. He's brought more people together than not.
Well, David Brooks and Gail Collins used to have a conversation, online conversation where the idea was that they represented different points of view and they'd have arguments. They hardly had any. Now she's doing it with Bret Stephens, and they struggle because he is supposed to be this sort of conservative Republican, but he hates Trump. So they're always... I mean, I think the Times actually did try to find a pro-Trump writer.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
And couldn't.
Yeah, that's a very tough thing.
Yeah. I mean, somebody that they also thought was good. But yeah, it's like there's been this odd kind of loss of point counter. Another thing Trump's done. In that way, you could say he's brought people together.
Yeah. Well, he did with the turnout last night, I can tell you that. Go ahead, Deborah.
Morning, Joe, also, just on his republicanism.
Right.
The op-ed section is my favorite, and that's the one I go to first thing in the morning. And I have favorite writers, too. But right now, Tom Friedman is my guru because one of the reasons may be that he's endorsing Mike Bloomberg, which I am endorsing, and we know he's the only one that can beat Trump.
But Mike just
He
dropped out
today.
Did he drop out?
He dropped out at 10:30. You see?
This is what
You
happens.
see how fast the cycle goes?
This is what happens when you're not home. Well, thanks for the information.
This is why we need second choice voting, you see.
Yeah, I know, it's true.
Anyhow, one of his columns, he had a punchline.
Send him any money.
He doesn't need it.
He
So.
won't take it.
He won't take it. Yeah. I love
Go
that.
ahead.
You had to send it
You
to
have
the
the floor.
MC. He had a column that I'll never forget because of his punchlines, and I wish more writers would do this. He said, Mike Bloomberg is as strong as a rattlesnake, and I just love that, and I'll never forget that column because of the punchline.
Yeah, that I don't remember
Wish
that.
more
I
people.
don't remember. Yeah.
Well, see, if you
Yeah.
had read it, maybe you would remember.
Well, I do read Tom Friedman, but I don't remember that. But that's a great.
that day.
That's a great line.
Isn't that a great line?
Because yeah, it was really amazing as somebody who I've lived in New York since 1979, so I've gone through a lot of mayors, and it was amazing seeing someone who's such a good mayor in so many ways be so bad in the debates. I was like, who is this man?
He doesn't
He
have
just doesn't have
personality,
that
unfortunately.
gift. Yeah, I know.
But we like him anyhow.
But was
don't
it
we?
Tom who wrote the column about how the Democrats have to come together and just take all those people,
Yeah,
put
the
them in
team
the
of
same?
rivals.
Yeah, that was nice.
That was
and
really
they
good
kind of
piece.
have
Every
done
column
that.
I like.
I feel like they're starting to do that because they're starting to drop out.
Sense of humor, which is.
Yeah.
Who's next?
Who's next? Back.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us today. I'm an undergraduate here, and I'm thinking about when you talk about how it's your part of your job is making people look at ideas that they don't naturally want to look at, that aren't comfortable for them. Do you think it's possible, or do you think that people who feel marginalized or hurt when those opinions are aired want to look at publications more? Like those publications and those ideas more when they see those ideas,
Well,
or
what
that
kind
they're
of
deterred?
what might hurt someone? I mean,
So I think specifically I'm thinking of in reference to the legacy article that came last semester. A lot of people seemed deterred and had a more negative view of the Daily Pennsylvanian who didn't agree with the article.
it was a pro legacy
Yes,
piece, right?
pro-legacy
So
piece,
for people
right.
who were like new to this country and didn't have legacy, it felt insulting and hurtful.
Right. So they didn't want to read the DP anymore. Do you feel
That's the risk. I mean, that's definitely the risk, and that's why people have always wanted to create their own groups and their own publications, and have sort of support for their ideas. I mean, ideally, a really good
Departure board at
really
the
with the
airport.
numbers on it.
And the numbers and the name of the story, the slug for the story, the name of the writer, and then the numbers. And stories keep dropping off the thing and going up and going down, and it's right there, and it shows everybody what the metrics are. And one of my friends who works there says it's just new opportunities for self-hatred. That's what she talks about.
Well, I mean, I was obsessed with the numbers when I was in op-ed. We would get numbers on. We didn't have the detail that people have now, but I'd see if we were on the most read list or the most emailed list, and I cared about that a lot. How can you not care? Mm-hmm. But I can't believe it's on a board.
Yeah, it's on a board. I've seen pictures of it. I'm going to ask one last question before we go, and this will give you one last chance to do a shout out for the importance of editors. I'm quoting Roger Angel, who the New Yorker writer, who's 99 years old now. And just said recently, he said, editing is a process of taking stuff that's pretty good, even potentially terrific, and making it better. Young writers are often terrified by this, but all of us need an editor or more than one. Anything you'd like to add to that before we break up?
There were a lot of reporters at the Times who just couldn't imagine why anyone would want to be an editor. It's I don't really know why it appeals to me so much, but I also really like to garden, and that's the only thing there's something about seeing this sort of weedy thing, and seeing patterns in it and seeing a path through it that really appeals to me. So for personally, I love the process, but I also love writers and I love to write. And the best editor-writer collaborations, there's like nothing like them. It's very exciting because when it works, the piece gets better, so everyone's happy. People complain a lot about book publishing now. I have so many friends who have books I've read for them. They say that editors don't edit anymore. I had a great editor. And when I turned in the first, I don't know, third of the book, he was like, I mean, you have to be tough to take editing, right? But after you've been a journalist for a long time, you have no feelings left. So he, because people get used to that in journalism. They don't get used to that in every business. People are much more polite in other businesses. And he said, this isn't really what I wanted. And I'm like, hey. My agent's like, this is great. He's going to love it. And he's like, no. He said, I want more voice. I want more of you. The big trend in everything now is for memoir, right? There's like, it just has to have more of you. I was very journalistic. And he wanted it to be more personal, which sort of was horrifying to me at once. But then I got into it. And he made everything better. I mean, he changed the way I looked at it, but he just, even on a line edit. And I think a lot of writers justifiably don't like editors because there's a lot of bad editors. And if you have an editor who makes you better and you can listen to that, it's a great experience. But haven't you had editors who've made your work worse?
I have, yes.
So have I.
Yes, she'll go unnamed forever. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Trish.
Thank you.